The strangest thing about the Book of Giants is not its giants, it is what disappeared. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve broken Aramaic fragments tied closely to Enoch, but no complete ancient copy survives. What remains suggests a wider Enochic tradition than the text most readers know today. So what did the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve in the Book of Giants that later readers of Enoch no longer had? The Book of Giants reaches us in a form that is suited to the question it raises, because what survives is not a complete book waiting to be opened from beginning to end, but a scattered body of ancient fragments, each preserving only a portion of a larger composition that once circulated among Jewish communities in antiquity. Some pieces contain only a few words, others preserve names, phrases, or brief stretches of narrative, and together they allow scholars to recognize a distinct work connected with the wider Enochic tradition, yet they do not restore the full shape of the original text. This matters because modern readers often imagine an ancient book as something fixed, complete, and stable, like a volume on a shelf, while the world in which these writings were copied was very different. Texts could exist in several manuscripts, in different collections, in different languages, and sometimes in forms that were never preserved equally across later centuries. The Book of Giants belongs to that older landscape of transmission, where survival depended not only on importance, but also on copying, storage, climate, historical disruption, and simple chance. The fragments associated with the work were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves near Qumran, and their Aramaic language places them within the same cultural environment in which other Enochic writings were also preserved. This does not mean that every manuscript in those caves was written by one group, nor does it mean that the presence of a text proves that everyone living nearby accepted it in the same way, but it does tell us that this story was known, copied, and valued enough to be preserved among a much larger collection of religious and literary writings. Even the physical condition of the surviving pieces shapes what can responsibly be said about them, because a torn edge can remove a name, a missing line can break a sequence, and a gap between fragments can hide the connection between two surviving ideas. Scholars therefore work with traces rather than with a complete narrative, comparing handwriting, language, material features, recurring characters, and parallels with related traditions in order to understand how the pieces may belong together. Some reconstructions are strong because several kinds of evidence support them, while others remain proposals rather than certainty. And the difference between those two levels is essential if we want to avoid turning an ancient fragment into a modern invention. This is also why the title of the Book of Giants can be misleading if heard too literally, because the ancient readers who encountered the work did not necessarily hold the same complete edition that later scholars try to imagine from surviving remains. What we call a book may once have existed in several copies, and those copies may not all have been identical. The deeper point is not that a secret volume was deliberately hidden and then dramatically rediscovered, but that ancient literature often reaches the present through uneven survival, with some works preserved almost whole and others reduced to scattered traces. In that sense, the Book of Giants begins not with giants themselves, but with absence, with the quiet fact that most of the text is gone, and with the equally important fact that enough remains to show that the lost work belonged to a real historical tradition of writing, reading, and reinterpretation. This places us close to one of the oldest human problems in the history of memory, because civilizations do not pass their entire intellectual world forward. They leave selections, fragments, copies, accidents, and silences, and every surviving manuscript is therefore both a source of knowledge and a reminder of how much cannot be recovered. Before asking what later readers of Enoch did not receive, we first have to understand that the Book of Giants is known precisely because a small part of it survived, while the greater part did not. The caves near Qumran did not preserve a single library in the modern sense, arranged by one editor with one clear purpose, yet together they opened a window onto a remarkably varied world of Jewish writing from the centuries around the turn of the era. Among biblical manuscripts, legal writings, prayers, hymns, interpretations, rules, calendars, and other compositions were fragments belonging to works associated with Enoch, and among those remains were pieces now identified with the Book of Giants. The setting matters because a text does not survive in isolation. It survives beside other texts, inside a physical place, within the habits of people who copied, carried, read, stored, and sometimes abandoned manuscripts. The dry climate of the Judean desert helped preserve materials that would normally decay, but preservation was uneven, leaving some scrolls relatively substantial and others reduced to pieces so small that their original order is difficult to reconstruct. When scholars encounter a fragment from the Book of Giants, they are therefore looking at more than words on old material. They are looking at evidence of a network of reading in which Enochic traditions occupied a visible place. Several Enochic compositions were represented among the Qumran finds, and the Book of Giants appears in Aramaic, the same language used in important portions of the older Enochic material found there. This linguistic connection does not prove that all of these works were written at Qumran, and it does not show that a single author designed them as one unified volume, but it strengthens the picture of an active literary tradition in which themes about Enoch, the Watchers, judgment, and the consequences of disorder could be expanded in more than one direction. Qumran also reminds us that the boundaries of ancient collections were not always identical to the boundaries later readers inherited, because texts could circulate independently before being gathered with others. While some writings remained outside later collections entirely, that difference is especially important for the Book of Giants, since a modern reader who knows Enoch through a surviving complete tradition may naturally assume that anything closely related to it must once have been a missing chapter, yet the manuscripts themselves encourage more caution. What survives near Qumran suggests proximity, shared themes, and literary relationship. But relationship is not the same as proof of original inclusion. The cave environment also changes how we think about loss. Because the manuscripts were not protected by a chain of continuous copying that carried every work into later religious communities. Instead, many texts reached us only because physical pieces remained hidden long enough to escape ordinary destruction. A copied book can disappear when communities stop reproducing it, when languages change, when collections are reorganized, when wars scatter libraries, or when later readers simply prefer other writings. And none of these possibilities requires a deliberate act of suppression. The Book of Giants is therefore valuable partly because it preserves a branch of ancient thought that did not survive in the same complete form as some related writings. Its presence at Qumran tells us that the story once had readers, scribes, and a place within a broader textual landscape, while its fragmentary state tells us how fragile that place ultimately was. This brings the question back toward the deeper history of human memory, because the earliest communities that wrote and recopied such traditions were doing what human groups have always done when confronting inherited stories. They selected, interpreted, expanded, and preserved some possibilities while allowing others to fade. What appears to us as a fixed boundary between one book and another may have been far less rigid during the periods when these traditions were still developing. The caves do not reveal every stage of that development, but they preserve enough to show that the Enochic world was larger than the single form most later readers came to know. Before the giants themselves can be understood, the physical landscape of Qumran teaches a quieter lesson, that ancient literature survives through places, materials, languages, and communities, and that every recovered fragment belongs to a history of transmission as much as to the story written upon it. A fragment can tell us more than its size suggests, but it can also tempt us to imagine more than it truly preserves, and the Book of Giants is a clear example of why that distinction matters. When scholars examine the surviving Aramaic manuscripts from Qumran, they begin with physical evidence, looking at the material on which words were written, the shape of letters, and the relationship between one piece and another. These details can help identify manuscripts that belong to the same composition, distinguish separate copies, and place a text within a setting, yet careful analysis cannot restore words that have vanished without leaving a trace. A broken line may preserve a recognizable name, a repeated phrase may connect one passage with another, and a sequence of actions may reveal something about the larger narrative, but every reconstruction must remain tied to what the manuscripts actually support. This is especially important with the Book of Giants because several copies are represented among the Qumran discoveries, showing that the work was copied more than once, while the surviving material remains incomplete. The existence of multiple manuscripts gives scholars points of comparison, but it does not provide a complete original, since different copies can preserve different stretches and many gaps remain between them. The Aramaic language also offers clues because vocabulary, grammar, and recurring expressions can be compared with other Jewish writings from the same cultural world, including Enochic compositions, and these comparisons can clarify relationships without proving that every related work once belonged inside one fixed collection. Names are useful because they can anchor otherwise damaged passages, and when a recognizable figure appears in more than one fragment, scholars can sometimes infer that separated pieces belong to the same narrative environment. Even then, responsible reconstruction is cautious, because resemblance is not identity, and a familiar name does not reveal everything that originally surrounded it. The same restraint applies when later versions of giant traditions are compared with the Qumran material, since later witnesses may preserve memories of older themes while also reflecting centuries of transmission, translation, adaptation, and reinterpretation. They can illuminate possibilities, but they cannot simply be copied backward into every missing line of an earlier manuscript. This difference between evidence and possibility is one of the important lessons preserved by the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the physical fragments force modern readers to confront the limits of historical knowledge directly. Ancient people lived inside worlds of stories, beliefs, fears, hopes, and inherited traditions that were much larger than the documents that survive them, and what reaches us is only a small remainder shaped by preservation and loss. The same problem appears throughout human history, from damaged inscriptions to incomplete letters and ruined archives, where the beginning of knowledge often lies not in filling every silence, but in recognizing which silences cannot honestly be filled. For the Book of Giants, this means that scholars can establish the existence of the work, identify its language, recognize several manuscripts, recover characters and episodes, and trace connections with the wider Enochic world, while still leaving many details unresolved. That uncertainty does not weaken the historical value of the text, because uncertainty itself tells us something about how ancient literature survives. The temptation to create a complete secret history from scattered remains is strongest where evidence is weakest, and resisting that temptation allows the surviving words to carry more weight. Each fragment becomes valuable not because it gives us permission to invent what is missing, but because it preserves a point of contact with a real ancient community of scribes and readers. Before asking what later forms of Enoch no longer contained, we therefore have to accept a quieter truth, that the Book of Giants can be studied responsibly only by allowing the surviving fragments to speak where they can, and allowing the empty spaces between them to remain empty where the evidence ends. Before the Book of Giants, before the Watchers were given names and motives, and before later Jewish writers expanded the story into a larger account of rebellion and judgment, there were only a few difficult lines in Genesis. Genesis 6-1-4 appears just before the flood narrative and describes a world in which human beings were multiplying. Daughters were born to them, and the sons of God saw that these women were beautiful and took wives from among them. The passage then mentions the Nephilim and speaks of figures remembered as mighty men of old, men of renown. It is brief, compressed, and unusually unexplained. The text does not pause to identify the sons of God in ordinary human terms, does not describe the Nephilim in detail, and does not provide the elaborate story that later readers would associate with them. That silence became important. In the Hebrew Bible, the expression translated as sons of God can point toward beings belonging to the divine realm. But Genesis 6 itself gives almost no explanation of who they are or why their unions with human women matter. The Nephilim are equally difficult. Modern popular culture often treats the word as if it automatically meant enormous human-like giants of a specific height. Yet the biblical passage gives no measurements and offers no biological description from which such claims could responsibly be made. What it gives us is a strange boundary crossing between a divine sphere and a human one, followed by the presence of extraordinary figures whose identity remains only partly defined. This small, textual space is the point from which much later interpretation grew. Ancient Jewish readers did not encounter Genesis as modern readers encounter a closed historical report. They read inherited sacred traditions, interpreted difficult passages, connected one text with another, and developed explanations for details that earlier writings left unresolved. The Book of the Watchers, preserved as the opening major composition within one Enoch, is one of the clearest examples of that process. There, the brief reference in Genesis is expanded into a much larger narrative involving heavenly beings who descend, take human wives, produce destructive offspring, and disturb the proper order of the world. Yet, it is important not to reverse the direction of evidence. Genesis 6 does not itself contain the complete Watcher's story in the form later found in Enochic literature. The later text interprets and enlarges an older cluster of motifs, giving narrative shape to questions that Genesis leaves open. That distinction matters for the Book of Giants because its world depends on this expanded tradition. The giants who eventually speak, dream, fear, judgment, and seek understanding do not emerge from a detailed biography in Genesis. They emerge from generations of interpretation surrounding a few ancient lines. This is one reason the history of the text is more interesting than claims about literal giant races or hidden archaeology. What can be documented is the development of literature. A short biblical passage existed. Later, Jewish writings elaborated its themes. And among those writings, a distinct story eventually focused more closely on the giant offspring themselves. The process tells us something fundamental about human memory as well. When communities inherit a story with gaps, they often preserve it by explaining it. An explanation can gradually become another tradition with its own characters, scenes, and questions. That does not make the later tradition a forgotten scientific record, nor does it make it meaningless. It shows how ancient people used narrative to think about disorder, violence, boundaries, responsibility, and judgment. The 4 verses in Genesis, therefore, matter less because they secretly contain the entire Book of Giants than because they created a small opening through which a much larger Enochic world could later develop. Seen from that perspective, the mystery begins with a literary fact. A short passage left enough uncertainty for later writers to ask who these beings really were. A few lines in Genesis were enough to create centuries of interpretation because they raised questions without answering them, and ancient Jewish writers often responded to such gaps by expanding inherited traditions rather than leaving them unexplained. The brief account of the sons of God, human women, the Nephilim, and the approach of the flood offered only a compressed picture, yet later readers could see within it several unresolved problems. Who were these beings? Why did their actions matter? How were their offspring connected with violence? And what relationship did all of this have to divine judgment? In the centuries before and around the beginning of the Common Era, some Jewish writings developed answers through stories associated with Enoch, a figure who appears only briefly in Genesis, but became far more important in later literature. These writings did not simply copy the biblical passage. They built around it, giving names, motives, consequences, speeches, journeys, and explanations to ideas that the older text had left open. The Book of the Watchers is the clearest surviving example. It describes heavenly beings who descend to earth, take human wives, produce destructive offspring, and introduce forms of knowledge that the narrative presents as dangerous or improperly revealed. Violence spreads. The created order is damaged, and judgment becomes necessary. None of this should be treated as a scientific account of human origins or as evidence for a lost race of biological giants. It belongs to the world of ancient religious literature, where stories could express concerns about boundaries, corruption, authority, and the consequences of disorder. What matters for the Book of Giants is that this expanded tradition changed the role of the offspring. In Genesis, they are mentioned only briefly, but in later Enochic material they become connected with a much larger moral and cosmic crisis. Once that narrative world existed, another question became possible. What would the story look like if attention moved away from the rebellious heavenly beings and toward the giant children who inherited the consequences of their actions? The Book of Giants appears to grow from that literary possibility. Its surviving fragments suggest a tradition in which giant figures are no longer merely background characters. They experience dreams, seek interpretation, recognize approaching judgment, and occupy a more active place in the unfolding story. This development helps explain why ancient literature should not be imagined as a fixed chain of books appearing one after another in perfectly stable form. Traditions could branch. A short scriptural passage could inspire one interpretation. That interpretation could generate another composition, and later communities could preserve some branches while others disappeared. The process resembles the broader history of human memory, in which inherited stories are rarely transmitted without selection and reinterpretation. People preserve what matters to them, clarify what seems obscure, and sometimes create new narratives around old questions. Yet, responsible historical reading must keep each stage distinct. Genesis is one text, the Book of the Watchers is another, and the Book of Giants is another still, even when they share characters and themes. Their relationship is meaningful precisely because they are not identical. The movement from a few mysterious verses to a larger tradition shows how literary worlds can grow without requiring us to claim that every later detail was secretly present from the beginning. That movement is important because it shows that the later tradition was not preserving a hidden transcript of prehistoric events, but participating in an ancient practice of interpretation. The value lies in tracing how ideas changed across texts, how one generation inherited questions from another, and how those questions could be reshaped without erasing their biblical starting point. What began as a brief and puzzling boundary crossing in Genesis became, over time, a framework for thinking about violence, knowledge, responsibility, and judgment. And within that expanding framework, the giants themselves finally moved from the edge of the story toward its center. The Watchers enter the story not as figures described in detail by Genesis, but through a later Jewish interpretation that gave shape to questions the older passage had left unresolved. In the Book of the Watchers, the mysterious sons of God become a group of heavenly beings who descend into the human world, take wives, and produce offspring whose presence is tied to growing violence and disorder. The narrative also connects these beings with the transmission of forms of knowledge that the text treats as improper or dangerous, creating a picture in which boundaries between heaven and earth have been crossed in more than one way. For ancient readers, this was not simply a tale about unusual creatures. It offered a framework for thinking about why a world created with order could become filled with corruption, and why judgment might follow. The Watchers themselves are given greater individuality than the brief figures in Genesis, and some are named. But the important point is not whether those names preserve biographies of historical beings. What survives is literary and religious evidence showing how one community of interpretation expanded an older scriptural problem into a larger moral universe. Within that universe, the giants are consequences before they are protagonists. They are born from the crossing of boundaries, become associated with destructive behavior, and stand inside a chain of events moving toward judgment. This position helps explain why the Book of Giants could later take the same inherited world and shift its focus. Once the Watchers had been given a fuller story, their offspring could also become subjects of reflection rather than merely signs of disorder. The fragments of the Book of Giants suggest precisely such a movement, because the giant figures there speak, dream, worry about what is approaching, and seek understanding of messages they do not fully grasp. That is a different literary angle from the one emphasized in the Book of the Watchers. The earlier composition concentrates heavily on the descent, transgression, corruption, and divine response, while the Book of Giants appears to spend more attention on beings who are already living inside the consequences of that earlier violation. This shift matters because it brings the central question of the title closer without answering it too early. What later readers of Enoch lacked was not necessarily material that had been physically cut away from a finished book, but access to every branch of a wider tradition that once developed around these themes. The Watchers' tradition demonstrates how flexible that world could be. Ancient Jewish authors could inherit a short scriptural passage, expand it into a story of heavenly rebellion, and then produce another composition that followed the giant offspring through dreams and approaching judgment. Human cultures have always preserved memory through this combination of continuity and change. A story can remain recognizable while its center of attention moves from one generation to another, from causes to consequences, or from an event to the people trapped within its aftermath. Yet the historical discipline lies in keeping those literary stages separate. Genesis does not describe the complete Watchers' narrative. The Book of the Watchers does not contain everything found in the Book of Giants, and the surviving Book of Giants does not allow every missing connection to be restored with certainty. What can be seen is a chain of interpretation rather than a chain of hidden facts. The surviving texts also remind us that ancient interpretation could preserve several answers to the same inherited question at once. One writing might emphasize the wrongdoing of heavenly beings, another the suffering or fear of their descendants, and another the larger movement toward judgment. Their coexistence is evidence of a living literary tradition, not evidence that one secret master version once contained every detail. By the time the giants begin to speak for themselves, the ancient story has already traveled far from the few compressed lines that began it, and that distance is exactly what makes the next surviving fragment so revealing. For many modern readers, the name Enoch suggests a single ancient book, complete in itself and transmitted as one continuous work, but the surviving evidence points to a more complicated history. The text commonly called 1 Enoch is a collection made up of several major compositions, each with its own themes, literary shape, and history of transmission. Some focus on the Watchers and their descent, some on heavenly journeys and cosmic order, some on visions involving history and judgment, and others on calendars, wisdom, or the fate of the righteous. These materials were eventually preserved together in the Ethiopic tradition, which is why later readers could encounter them as one work associated with Enoch. Yet the manuscripts from Qumran show that important Enochic writings circulated in Aramaic long before the complete Ethiopic collection known today was copied in its surviving form. This changes the way the Book of Giants must be approached. If one Enoch were imagined as one fixed book created at a single moment, then a related work found outside it might appear to be something removed from an original whole. But if Enochic literature developed as a group of connected writings that could circulate separately, overlap in themes, and be combined differently across time, then the absence of the Book of Giants from the later collection requires a different explanation. It may represent a neighboring branch of the same literary world rather than a missing chapter cut from a finished volume. The distinction is small in wording but large in historical meaning. Ancient books did not always have the stable boundaries that modern printed books encourage us to expect. A composition could be copied on its own, joined to another, translated, expanded, shortened, or simply cease to be copied while related works continued. The name of an authoritative figure such as Enoch could connect several writings without proving that they were all produced by one author or designed from the beginning as a single book. This is especially important because Enoch himself occupies only a small place in Genesis, where he is remembered as a man who walked with God and was taken by God. Yet later, Jewish literature transformed him into a figure associated with heavenly knowledge, revelation, judgment, and the interpretation of mysteries. His name became a literary center around which different traditions could gather. That development tells us something about the beginnings of human textual memory as well. Communities do not preserve the past as an untouched object. They copy what remains meaningful, arrange inherited materials, interpret difficult passages, and transmit some texts more successfully than others. Over generations, a collection can appear more unified than the earlier stages from which it grew. The Dead Sea Scrolls allow us to look behind that later appearance because they preserve multiple Enochic compositions in an older manuscript environment. They do not give us every step in the formation of one Enoch, and they do not provide a simple map showing exactly when every work entered or remained outside a collection. What they do provide is enough evidence to resist the idea of one original, perfectly fixed Enoch book from which everything else must have been removed. The Enoch most readers know is therefore both real and historically layered, a surviving collection that preserves traditions, but not necessarily the complete boundary of everything that once belonged to the wider Enochic world. That wider setting also explains why manuscript evidence matters more than assumptions. When compositions survive beside one another, their proximity can reveal shared language and concerns without forcing them into a single original sequence. The task is therefore to trace relationships while preserving uncertainty where the manuscripts remain silent. Understanding that difference brings us closer to the central mystery of the Book of Giants, because what disappeared may not have been a page from one book, but one branch of a much larger forest of texts. The manuscripts from Qumran reveal something that is easy to miss when reading one Enoch as a single book today. Several Enochic writings once circulated as separate compositions rather than as one permanently fixed collection. Fragments written in Aramaic preserve material corresponding to major works that later became associated with one Enoch, including traditions about the Watchers, heavenly journeys, calendrical knowledge, visions, and judgment. Their physical separation matters because manuscripts are evidence not only for what people believed, but also for how texts actually moved through communities. A composition copied on its own could be read, discussed, and transmitted independently before later generations placed it beside other writings linked with the same ancient figure. This older manuscript landscape does not show us a moment when someone sat down and assembled every Enochic work into a final authorized volume. Instead, it suggests a longer process in which related writings existed beside one another, shared themes, and were preserved with different degrees of success. Some of those writings eventually entered the collection now called One Enoch, while others, including the Book of Giants, did not survive there in the same way. That difference is central to understanding what may appear to have been left out. The phrase can easily suggest deliberate removal, as though a complete book once contained a known chapter and someone later cut it away. The surviving evidence does not require that scenario. A simpler historical possibility is that ancient readers inherited a family of connected Enochic texts whose boundaries were still flexible, and that later traditions preserved only some members of that family together. The Book of Giants fits naturally into such a world because it shares characters, concerns, and narrative background with the Watcher's tradition, yet the manuscripts also allow it to be recognized as its own composition. This resembles many other moments in the history of writing, where collections gradually form around material that was once transmitted separately. Human memory often becomes organized after the fact. A later reader sees a bound collection and imagines that the boundaries must always have existed, while the older evidence may reveal a less tidy beginning. The same caution is necessary with Enoch. The name Enoch could provide authority and continuity across several compositions without proving that one historical author created every line or that all related writings were intended to remain together forever. What Qumran preserves is therefore not a lost table of contents, but a snapshot of a literary world still capable of variation. Different manuscripts may preserve different works, and the absence of one composition from a later collection may result from changing patterns of copying, translation, religious use, or simple survival rather than an identifiable act of exclusion. This matters because the history of texts is shaped by material conditions as much as by ideas. A work that is copied repeatedly can travel across languages and centuries. A work that stops being copied may almost disappear even if it was once familiar. Parchment decays, libraries are scattered, communities change, and languages cease to be widely read. The survival of ancient literature is therefore selective, without always being intentional. Such losses have accompanied written culture since its earliest surviving archives, reminding us that the beginning of human textual memory was never a perfect chain from one generation to the next. Every preserved tradition stands beside others that were copied less often, translated differently, or lost entirely. By looking at separate Aramaic manuscripts, we are seeing a period before later transmission made the Enochic tradition appear more unified than it had once been. That view brings us closer to the Book of Giants, because its absence from the complete form of one Enoch is no longer mysterious in the same way. It becomes one example of a larger historical pattern in which related writings can share a world, influence one another, and still follow different paths through time. The important question is not simply why one text was removed, but how one branch survived outside the collection while others became the Enoch later generations inherited. Enoch became far more important in later Jewish literature than the few lines devoted to him in Genesis might suggest, and that growth helps explain why so many different writings could gather around his name without having begun as one single composition. In Genesis, Enoch appears briefly in a genealogy and is remembered for walking with God before being taken away, but later traditions transformed that unusual biblical memory into a foundation for stories about heavenly journeys, hidden knowledge, cosmic order, judgment, and the fate of generations. His name could therefore function as a point of authority, linking texts that addressed related questions while still developing in different directions. This is one reason the Enochic world is better imagined as a literary network than as a modern book produced from beginning to end by one identifiable writer. The surviving Aramaic manuscripts from Qumran strengthen that picture because they preserve several works connected with Enoch in forms that reveal both relationship and independence. Themes overlap, characters return, and ideas about the heavenly realm, human violence, forbidden knowledge, and judgment appear across more than one composition. Yet those similarities do not erase the boundaries between the writings themselves. The Book of Giants belongs naturally inside this network because its story assumes the world of the Watchers and their offspring. While shifting attention toward the giants and the consequences they face, Enoch remains important within that setting. But the work does not need to have been physically embedded inside a fixed copy of one Enoch in order to belong to the same intellectual tradition. This distinction becomes especially useful when thinking about how human communities preserve authority. A respected ancient figure can become the center of many later reflections, just as a remembered teacher, king, or sage can attract stories that develop long after the earliest account of that person. In the case of Enoch, the process produced a body of literature rather than a simple biography. Ancient writers used his name to explore questions that mattered within their own religious and historical worlds, and later communities inherited only some of those explorations in complete form. The result is uneven survival. One composition may be preserved through translation, another may survive in fragments, and another may disappear except for references or distant echoes. Nothing about that pattern requires a secret act of removal. It is part of the ordinary vulnerability of written memory. From the earliest archives onward, human beings have depended on fragile materials, changing languages, communities of copyists, and repeated acts of selection to carry words across centuries. Every text that survives does so because someone continued to preserve it, while countless others fell outside that chain. Seen in this light, Enoch is not the owner of one lost master volume, but the center of a wider field of ancient interpretation whose original boundaries are no longer fully recoverable. This also changes the meaning of absence. When the Book of Giants is missing from the later, complete form of one Enoch, the safest conclusion is not that someone deliberately erased it, but that different Enochic writings followed different paths of transmission. Some were gathered together, some remained separate, and some survived only accidentally in damaged manuscripts. The Dead Sea Scrolls allow us to glimpse that earlier diversity before later transmission made the tradition appear more settled. They show a world in which one ancient name could support many connected texts, and in which the story of the giants was close enough to Enoch to belong to his literary universe without needing to be a missing chapter from a single original book. That wider library around Enoch is the necessary background for understanding why the giants can now move fully into view. Only after recognizing this older landscape can we ask what giant narratives contributed, because their importance lies not in proving hidden events, but in revealing another path interpretation once took. The children of the Watchers occupy an unusual place in the Enochic tradition because they are born into a crisis they did not begin, yet they quickly become symbols of the disorder that follows from it. In the Book of the Watchers, their existence is tied to the union between heavenly beings and human women, and the narrative presents their growth as one consequence of a boundary that should not have been crossed. Their destructive behavior becomes one element in a wider picture in which violence spreads across the earth, ordinary life is disrupted, and the created order is pushed toward judgment. The text does not ask modern biological questions about how such beings could exist, nor does it provide evidence that they belong to a lost human population. Its concerns are literary, moral, and religious. The giants stand inside a story about consequences. They are not simply large bodies moving through an ancient landscape, but figures who embody what happens when an act of rebellion produces effects that continue into another generation. This becomes especially important when the Book of Giants takes up the same inherited world and allows those offspring to occupy more of the foreground. In the earlier Watchers tradition, attention falls heavily on the heavenly beings who descend, teach forbidden knowledge, and violate the established boundary between heaven and earth. Their children are important, but they are often described through the damage associated with them. In the Book of Giants, the surviving fragments suggest a change in emphasis. Some of the giant figures are given names, speak to one another, receive troubling dreams, and seek help in understanding what those dreams might mean. The result is not a complete change in moral position, because the coming judgment still hangs over them, but the literary distance becomes smaller. The fragments do not give us enough to reconstruct every motive or conversation, and where words are missing, the silence must remain. Yet what survives is sufficient to show that these figures had a more developed narrative presence than the brief notice in Genesis. They are no longer only the consequence seen from outside. They become beings within the story who confront the possibility that their world is approaching an end. That shift may help explain why the work felt distinct enough to circulate as its own composition. It takes a familiar Enochic crisis and follows it from another angle, moving from the generation that crossed the boundary to the generation living inside the aftermath. Human societies have often used stories in this way, returning to inherited events and asking what they meant for those who came later. The process does not require us to imagine that ancient writers possessed hidden historical records. It shows that traditions can deepen by changing perspective. A story first concerned with the cause of disorder can later become concerned with the people or beings who inherit that disorder. For the Book of Giants, this inherited burden is central. The giant children do not need to be treated as archaeological creatures for the text to matter. Their significance lies in how ancient writers used them to think about responsibility across generations, the consequences of actions that cannot easily be reversed, and the fear that follows when judgment becomes imaginable. This also keeps the connection to human origins in a careful place. Genesis begins with human families multiplying across the earth, and the later Enochic tradition inserts the Watcher's crisis into that early world, not as a scientific account of prehistory, but as a theological explanation for why violence and corruption seemed so deeply rooted in the human story. The Book of Giants then moves one step further by asking what becomes of the offspring created within that damaged order. In doing so, it turns inherited figures from a brief biblical mystery into active figures in a larger meditation on consequence, memory, and the fate of a generation born after the decisive act has already occurred. The names that emerge from the broken Aramaic lines of the Book of Giants are among the most revealing details preserved at Qumran, because they show that the work was not speaking only about anonymous beings inherited from Genesis, but about individual figures placed inside a larger narrative world. Several names are associated with the surviving material, including Oya, Haya, and Mahaway, while other fragments preserve names that scholars have connected with famous figures from Mesopotamian tradition, most notably Gilgamesh. These names must be handled carefully, because the condition of the manuscripts is uneven, and some readings depend on reconstruction. Yet their presence helps distinguish the Book of Giants from the shorter biblical notice about the Nephilim. The giants here are given identities, relationships, and roles that allow them to speak, respond, travel, and seek understanding. Oya and Haya are especially important in later reconstructions of the narrative because they appear as giant figures linked with troubling dreams and the expectation of judgment, while Mahaway is associated with a journey to seek Enoch, whose wisdom is needed to interpret what the giants have encountered. Such details do not transform the story into a historical record of named prehistoric individuals, Because the manuscripts belong to ancient religious literature rather than to archaeology or biological anthropology, what they show instead is how far the tradition had developed from the compressed language of Genesis. An ancient writer could begin with unnamed offspring of heavenly beings and then create a narrative in which those offspring possessed recognizable identities and participated in their own unfolding fate. The appearance of the name Gilgamesh is even more striking because Gilgamesh was already a famous figure in Mesopotamian literary tradition long before the Qumran manuscripts were copied. Scholars have therefore examined whether the Book of Giants reflects knowledge of Mesopotamian stories, names, or cultural memories that had traveled westward through centuries of contact. The safest conclusion is not that the Jewish text simply copied the Epic of Gilgamesh or that the two works describe the same historical person, but that ancient literary traditions could borrow, reshape, and relocate familiar names within new religious frameworks. Names themselves can travel farther than complete stories, changing meaning as languages and communities change. This is a pattern visible throughout human history, where remembered heroes, places, and motifs pass between cultures while being adapted to different explanations of the world. In the Book of Giants, a name associated elsewhere with heroic kingship could be placed among giant figures facing divine judgment, showing not sameness but transformation. The fragments therefore preserve two kinds of memory at once: an Enochic memory built from Jewish interpretation of Genesis and traces of a broader Near Eastern literary environment in which older names could still be recognized. Because the surviving lines are damaged, however, scholars cannot reconstruct every relationship with confidence, and similarities must not be expanded into claims that the manuscripts themselves do not make. This restraint is essential to the central question, because what later readers lost was not merely a list of extraordinary names, but access to a version of the Enochic world in which these named giants had more narrative space. The broken lines let us see just enough of that world to know it existed, while leaving large areas beyond recovery. This personalization also changes the emotional distance of the narrative, because judgment is no longer directed toward an undefined mass alone. Named figures can receive messages, misunderstand them, discuss them, and search for an answer, giving the ancient audience a way to follow consequences across generations. Yet here the text remains fragmentary, so modern readers must resist assigning personalities, motives, or family histories that the surviving words cannot support. Slowly, the giants are becoming less like a mysterious category inherited from a few ancient verses, and more like literary characters whose names carried the weight of several traditions into one fragmented story. The crisis described in the Enochic tradition remains the same, but the point of view changes when the giants move from the background into the center of the surviving narrative. In the Book of the Watchers, the decisive action belongs largely to the heavenly beings who cross a forbidden boundary, take human wives, transmit knowledge that the story presents as dangerous, and bring disorder into the human world. The giant offspring appear as consequences of that rupture, associated with violence and with a world moving toward judgment. The Book of Giants does not erase that framework. Yet the surviving fragment suggests that it looks at the same crisis from a different distance. Instead of concentrating mainly on the moment when the boundary is crossed, it follows beings who are already living inside the results. They did not create the original transgression described by the Watcher's tradition, but they are bound to its consequences, and the narrative allows them to become aware that something is approaching. The problem is no longer only how disorder began, but what happens within a generation that inherits a damaged world and realizes that its future has been shaped by actions that came before it. The fragments do not preserve enough material to tell us exactly how every giant understood that condition, so modern readers should not invent private thoughts or emotions beyond what the text supports. What can be seen is a pattern of speech, dreams, questions, and attempts to seek interpretation. Those elements create a narrative in which judgment is not merely announced from outside. It becomes something the giant figures begin to recognize through signs they cannot fully understand. That is a significant literary development from the brief notice in Genesis, where the Nephilim appear and disappear within only a few lines. Across the later Enochic tradition, a small biblical mystery becomes a larger meditation on cause and consequence, and the Book of Giants carries that meditation into another generation. The giants are not historical evidence for a prehistoric race, yet the structure of their story touches a recognizable human problem. The consequences of one generation can become the environment of the next. In the Enochic world, that environment is presented on a cosmic scale. Boundaries have been crossed, violence has spread, and the possibility of reversal is narrowing. The giant figures, therefore, occupy an unusual position between cause and punishment. They are products of the earlier violation, but they are also active participants in the disorder that follows. The surviving material does not reduce them to innocent victims, nor does it make them simple symbols of evil. It gives them enough narrative presence to show that they are caught within a chain of consequences already larger than any single character. That chain helps explain why their dreams matter later in the story. A dream can turn a distant judgment into a personal warning without explaining everything at once. It can reveal that the future is becoming visible before it arrives, while leaving the dreamer uncertain about what the vision means. The Book of Giants appears to use that device to move its characters from action toward recognition. Violence remains in the background, but attention begins to shift towards signs, messages, and interpretation. A shared mythic world could support more than one narrative emphasis. One composition could explain the descent of the Watchers, while another could follow the giant offspring as they confront the end of the world they know. None of these differences requires a lost master edition containing every perspective. They make more sense within a living literary tradition capable of returning to the same inherited crisis from different angles. By the time the giants begin to receive dreams, the story has moved beyond the question of how they came into existence. The deeper question has become what happens when a generation finally recognizes that the consequences surrounding it were set in motion before it understood them. Before judgment becomes visible, it appears in the Book of Giants through dreams that disturb the giant figures and force them to seek meaning in images they cannot explain. This is a shift preserved by the fragments, because the giants are no longer presented only as beings acting within a damaged world. They are also shown receiving signs that suggest their world will not continue as it has. Among the surviving material, Haya and Ohia are associated with troubling visions, and others are unable to settle their meaning. The dreams do not function like modern predictions that can be checked against a timetable, and the text gives no basis for treating them as historically verifiable supernatural records. Within the literary world, their purpose is to make approaching judgment imaginable before it arrives, turning a cosmic decision into a problem that the characters must confront. This matters, because the Book of Giants belongs to a tradition already moving toward destruction. Yet the surviving fragments allow that movement to unfold through uncertainty, rather than immediate catastrophe. The dreamers see images, the group discusses them, and the need for interpretation becomes more important than physical power. A giant may dominate a story through size or reputation, but a dream cannot be overcome by strength, and that reversal gives the narrative a quieter tension. What threatens these figures first is incomplete knowledge that something has changed and that they do not understand what it means. Ancient Jewish literature often used dreams and visions to communicate hidden meaning, but each text must be read within its own setting. And the images preserved here should not be detached from the Enochic framework and turned into predictions about later history. Their immediate context is the fate of the giants and the judgment embedded in the Watcher's tradition. Some surviving lines appear to preserve imagery involving a garden or cultivated growth and overwhelming destruction, while another vision presents a scene associated with heavenly authority and judgment. Because the manuscripts are damaged, the exact sequence and wording cannot always be recovered, and later reconstructions must distinguish what can be read from what is supplied to bridge gaps. Even so, the larger movement is clear enough to follow, because the giants recognize that the visions matter and seek an interpreter whose authority exceeds their own. That movement eventually leads toward Enoch, the figure who, in this literary universe, stands closer to revealed knowledge than the giants do. Here, the story turns toward one of the oldest patterns in human attempts to make sense of uncertainty: the search for meaning when an image or event seems larger than ordinary understanding. People across many cultures have treated dreams as significant, but what can safely be said is not that dreams reveal the future, but that ancient texts often represented them as meaningful channels within their religious worlds. The Book of Giants preserves such a use because its dreamers belong to a generation already marked for consequence. They receive warning without complete explanation, and that delay allows the narrative to move from violence toward recognition. The giants have entered a stage in which the central problem is no longer simply what they have done, but whether they can understand what is coming. This is where the fragmented manuscript becomes strangely appropriate to the experience described within it, because readers possess incomplete signs just as the characters possess incomplete visions. We know enough to recognize a pattern of warning, consultation, and approaching judgment, but not enough to restore every image or response. The responsible reading therefore remains patient, allowing the dreams to function as ancient literary devices rather than as coded evidence for hidden history. What survives is quieter than a story about giant bodies, because it is a story about beings confronted by a message they cannot yet interpret, and about the moment when certainty begins to disappear before judgment has fully arrived. Fear in the Book of Giants should be handled carefully, because the surviving fragments do not give us access to the private psychology of the characters, and modern language can easily make an ancient literary scene sound more certain than the evidence allows. What the fragments do preserve is behavior that suggests unease. Giant figures discuss disturbing dreams, recognize that the images may concern their future, and seek someone capable of explaining what they have seen. That sequence allows us to speak about anxiety within the story without pretending that we know exactly how each figure felt. The difference matters because ancient texts often communicate emotion indirectly, through speech, hesitation, requests for interpretation, or changes in action, rather than through the detailed inner monologues familiar from modern fiction. In the Book of Giants, the most important sign of fear is not a description of trembling bodies or panic, but the recognition that strength offers no answer to a message that cannot be understood. These beings belong to a tradition in which they are associated with violence and physical power, yet the dreams place them in a condition of uncertainty. They can act, speak, and move, but they cannot control the meaning of what has appeared before them. The story, therefore, turns from outward force toward dependence on interpretation. This is where Enoch becomes important, because his role in the wider Enochic tradition is connected with revealed knowledge, heavenly mysteries, and the ability to communicate meaning that others cannot reach on their own. When the giants seek help, the narrative does not require us to imagine remorse in the modern moral sense, nor does it prove that they suddenly understand every consequence of their actions. It shows that they recognize a warning, and that recognition changes what they do next. Such restraint is important when reading ancient religious literature. A damaged manuscript can preserve enough to reveal narrative movement while leaving motives uncertain, and the responsible approach is to follow that movement without filling the gaps with invented emotions. The same principle applies to the human history of fear more broadly. People have always faced events they could not fully explain, but historians cannot assume that ancient individuals experienced uncertainty in exactly the categories used today. What can be traced is how communities represented uncertainty in their stories. In this text, dreams become one way of placing characters between knowledge and ignorance, between a past that has already produced consequences and a future that has not yet arrived. The giants are not frightened because the manuscript gives us a clinical description of fear. They appear troubled because they respond to signs, consult one another, and search for an interpreter. That difference keeps the reading close to the evidence. It also deepens the central question surrounding the Book of Giants, because the work preserves a perspective that later readers of the surviving Enoch collection did not receive in the same form. The Watcher's tradition explains rebellion and judgment, while this related composition gives more space to the descendants who begin to perceive what judgment may mean for them. Their uncertainty becomes part of the story itself. The dream does not need to be decoded by a modern reader as a hidden prophecy about archaeology, climate, or future civilizations. Its literary function is already sufficient. It tells the audience that the order surrounding these figures is nearing an end, and that those inside it can sense the change before they can explain it. That question stays within the world of the manuscript, yet it also explains why the surviving dream scenes matter much, even when many surrounding lines have been lost to time. In that quiet interval between warning and understanding, the giants become less important for their imagined size and more important for the ancient question they embody. What does a being do when power remains, but certainty has begun to disappear? Once the dreams have been shared and their meaning remains uncertain, the surviving fragments of the Book of Giants turn toward Enoch, the figure associated in the wider Enochic tradition with knowledge that ordinary characters cannot reach on their own. The giants do not simply receive an explanation where they are. Instead, Mahaway is sent to seek Enoch and obtain an interpretation of the visions. That movement is important because it changes the balance of the story. The beings associated with enormous power are placed in the position of needing guidance from someone whose authority comes not from size or force, but from access to knowledge. The fragments are damaged, so the exact route, sequence, and details of Mahaway's journey cannot be reconstructed with confidence, and later versions of the tradition should not be used to fill every missing line as though they preserved an unchanged copy. What can be said is that Mahaway functions as a messenger between the giants and Enoch, and that this role links the troubling dreams with the interpretation that follows. Enoch already occupies a distinctive place in related writings. The brief biblical figure who walked with God became, in later Jewish literature, a recipient of heavenly revelation and a mediator of knowledge about judgment, cosmic order, and events hidden from ordinary sight. The Book of Giants draws on that established literary identity. When the giants turn toward Enoch, they are not approaching a military leader or a ruler who can change events by force. They are seeking someone who can tell them what the signs mean. The problem is no longer whether the giants can resist another physical opponent. It is whether understanding can alter anything once judgment has already been set in motion. The surviving material does not allow us to claim that every giant responds in the same way, nor does it provide a complete emotional record of their reaction. It preserves enough, however, to show a movement from dream to discussion, from discussion to inquiry, and from inquiry toward Enoch. Ancient societies often represented dreams as messages requiring interpretation, and the search for a trusted interpreter appears in many literary traditions. But here the device belongs specifically to the Enochic world created around the Watchers and their offspring. The dreams concern the fate of beings whose existence is already tied to disorder, and Enoch's authority comes from the same tradition that places him close to revealed knowledge. This makes the episode more than a pause between larger events. It reveals how the Book of Giants reorganizes familiar Enochic material around questions of recognition. Earlier narratives explain how the crisis began. Here, descendants living inside that crisis become aware that signs are pointing toward an end they cannot read by themselves. The pattern also reflects something basic in the history of human memory. Communities have long turned to people, texts, and inherited traditions when events seem difficult to interpret, not because those interpreters always possessed objective knowledge in the modern sense, but because cultures create recognized forms of authority for making uncertainty meaningful. Enoch stands at the boundary between what the giants perceive and what the story presents as a larger order beyond them. Mahawe's mission therefore brings two different kinds of power into contact: the physical power associated with the giants and the interpretive authority associated with Enoch. Only one of them can answer the problem created by the dreams. Yet even interpretation does not necessarily offer escape. To understand a warning is not the same as being able to reverse what it announces. That quiet distinction prepares the narrative for what follows, because the giants' search for knowledge brings them closer to the meaning of judgment rather than farther from it. By seeking Enoch, they move from uncertainty toward an answer, but the answer belongs to a world in which consequences have already begun to take shape within the story. Violence in the Enochic tradition is not presented as an isolated act committed by a few unusual beings. It spreads outward until the condition of the whole earth appears damaged, and this wider setting is essential for understanding why judgment becomes unavoidable within the story. The Book of the Watchers describes the offspring of the heavenly beings as consuming what human communities produce and eventually turning their destructive force against living creatures and against one another. The language is deliberately large in scale because the concern is not to provide an archaeological report of prehistoric conflict, but to portray a world in which ordinary boundaries have broken down. Food, life, knowledge, and authority no longer remain in their proper places, and violence becomes evidence that the disorder begun by the Watchers has moved beyond a single generation. The Book of Giants inherits this moral landscape rather than creating a separate catastrophe. Its giant figures already live inside a world whose future has been shaped by the earlier transgression, and the dreams they receive make sense only because judgment is approaching a condition that the narrative has already described as deeply corrupted. This helps explain why the giants cannot simply be treated as unusually large warriors from a forgotten age. Their importance is literary and theological, because they represent consequences that have become larger than the original act that produced them. The earth itself becomes part of that pattern, not as a scientific description of environmental collapse, but as a moral image of creation suffering under violence. Ancient Jewish writers could speak of the land crying out, of bloodshed demanding response, or of creation losing its proper order. And such language belongs to a long scriptural tradition in which human wrongdoing affects more than the individual wrongdoer. Within that tradition, violence has a social dimension as well as a cosmic one. Once it becomes normal, every relationship is altered, and the world described by the story moves farther from the ordered beginning imagined in creation. This connection to human origins is important, because the Enochic writers were looking back toward the earliest generations of humanity, not to reconstruct biological prehistory, but to ask why violence seemed so deeply rooted in human experience. Genesis had already placed the flood after a description of a world filled with corruption and violence. And later, Enochic literature developed that theme by connecting the crisis with the Watchers and their offspring. The result is a narrative explanation rather than a historical measurement. It tells the audience what disorder means within a religious worldview, not what archaeology must discover in the ground. The Book of Giants, therefore, belongs inside a larger meditation on inherited damage. Its characters are not standing at the beginning of the problem, and they are not outside it. They are born into the consequences of an older breach and then contribute to the violence that surrounds them. This makes their later search for interpretation more significant, because the warning they receive is not detached from what has happened before. The dreams point toward judgment precisely because the story has already established a world in which power has become destructive and limits have failed. The movement from violence to warning is therefore gradual rather than sudden. First, the order of the world is disturbed, then destruction spreads, then signs appear, and finally the characters begin to understand that consequences are approaching. No hidden archaeology is required for this pattern to carry meaning. Its value lies in showing how ancient writers used the language of a damaged earth to think about responsibility, inherited disorder, and the danger of violence becoming larger than the generation that first set it in motion. The warning is therefore rooted in the condition of the world already described. By the time the giants look for answers, the world around them has already become the evidence that something has gone wrong. The flood stands behind the Book of Giants as the great horizon of judgment, but the surviving fragments do not need to describe every stage of that catastrophe for its presence to shape the story. Genesis already places the flood after a world described as corrupt and filled with violence. And later, Enochic writers expanded that setting by connecting the crisis with the Watchers, their offspring, and the disruption of the created order. In that literary world, the flood is not simply weather. It becomes the boundary between an age that has gone wrong and a future in which that disorder will be brought to an end. The giants therefore receive their dreams and warnings inside a story whose direction is already known to the audience. Something is approaching that they cannot stop through strength, and the meaning of their visions becomes more serious because the wider tradition has already linked violence with judgment. Historical caution is important here. Flood traditions appear in several ancient Near Eastern cultures, and scholars study how biblical and Mesopotamian stories may share motifs and older cultural memories, but those literary relationships do not prove that one worldwide flood covered the entire planet in the manner described by religious narratives. The Book of Giants should not be treated as a hidden scientific record of a global disaster. Its value lies elsewhere. The flood functions as a moral and narrative horizon, allowing ancient writers to think about what happens when violence becomes so extensive that the world itself is imagined as needing renewal. This connects the story back to human beginnings in a careful way. Genesis places the flood very early in the history of humanity, after the first generations have already experienced rivalry, killing, and growing corruption. Later, Enochic tradition inserts the Watcher's crisis into that same early world and gives another explanation for why disorder has become so severe. These texts are not modern accounts of population history or prehistoric ecology. They are ancient attempts to understand why human life appears vulnerable to violence and why wrongdoing can spread beyond the person who first commits it. The Book of Giants inherits that concern through the generation born from the Watchers. Their future is tied to a judgment that reaches beyond individual punishment. The coming destruction concerns an entire order that has become unsustainable within the logic of the story. That is why the dreams matter. A warning about a single enemy could be answered with force, but a warning about the end of an age cannot be handled in the same way. The giants seek interpretation because they need to understand the scale of what is approaching. Enoch does not offer them greater physical power. He represents access to knowledge about the order of events and the judgment moving toward them. The flood therefore creates a contrast between power and limitation. The giants may be portrayed as extraordinary beings, yet they remain unable to control the larger structure of the narrative. Their strength cannot repair the world that has been damaged, and it cannot erase the consequences connected with the Watchers and their descendants. The central issue is not the size of the bodies involved, but the inability of power to reverse a chain of consequences once the world of the story has been placed under judgment. Because the Book of Giants survives only in fragments, modern readers should resist reconstructing every missing detail from later versions or from Genesis itself. The flood may stand behind the surviving scenes without every connection being preserved in the damaged manuscripts. What can be said safely is that the work belongs to the same broad Enochic environment in which the Watchers, giant offspring, violence, and judgment are closely linked. That relationship is enough to explain why the dreams carry such weight and why the search for interpretation becomes urgent. The flood does not need to be turned into a geological claim to matter. Within the ancient story, it represents the point at which inherited disorder reaches its limit, and the giant generation begins to understand that the world they know may not continue. The giants are remembered because of their extraordinary scale. Yet within the Enochic tradition, their physical size is far less important than the judgment gathering around them. Modern retellings often reverse that balance. They concentrate on how tall such beings might have been, whether enormous bones have ever been discovered, or whether ancient stories preserve memories of a forgotten biological population. The surviving texts do not provide reliable evidence for those claims. What they preserve is a religious and literary world in which the giants matter because they participate in violence, inherit the consequences of the Watchers, and eventually confront a limit that physical strength cannot overcome. This distinction brings the story closer to its original concerns. The problem is not that the earth contains bodies that are too large. The problem is that power has become separated from order. In the Book of the Watchers, the giant offspring consume, destroy, and contribute to a world already described as corrupt. In the Book of Giants, attention turns toward the moment when some of these figures begin to recognize through dreams and messages that this condition will not continue indefinitely. Their size may make them impressive inside the imagination of the story, but judgment reduces that advantage to almost nothing. A being can be powerful enough to dominate those around it and still remain powerless before consequences that operate on a larger scale. That contrast explains why Enoch becomes more important than any weapon or contest of strength. The giants seek knowledge because force cannot answer the question placed before them. Their dreams announce a problem of meaning rather than combat. The coming judgment does not challenge them to become stronger. It reveals that strength itself has reached a boundary. This is also where the text connects with a broader human concern that extends far beyond stories of supernatural beings. Human societies have repeatedly asked what happens when power grows faster than restraint, when one generation inherits systems created by another, and when consequences continue after the original choices can no longer be undone. The Enochic writers express these questions through an imagined early world populated by Watchers and giants. They were not writing anthropology of actual prehistoric humans, and their narratives cannot tell us how the first human communities physically lived. They were using the distant beginnings of humanity as a setting in which disorder could be traced back toward its imagined roots. By placing judgment there, the tradition made violence appear not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a challenge to the proper structure of creation. The Book of Giants inherits that framework and gives it another perspective. The descendants of the original transgression are no longer merely described from outside. They encounter signs that their position is unstable, and the audience is invited to watch physical dominance become increasingly irrelevant. This makes the surviving fragments valuable even without knowing the giant's supposed measurements, appearance, or historical location. Their narrative role can be understood without any of those details. They show how ancient writers could turn the idea of extraordinary strength into a lesson about limitation. What cannot be defeated by another body may still be ended by judgment. What appears permanent to one generation may already be approaching its boundary within the larger order of the story. The flood stands behind this realization, not as geological proof offered to modern science, but as the narrative point at which the damaged world reaches its limit. Once this is understood, the giants no longer need to be treated as the central mystery simply because they are giants. Their more important function is to reveal what happens when power survives longer than wisdom, when inherited consequences become unavoidable, and when beings who once seemed beyond ordinary limits discover that they were never beyond consequence. One of the most unexpected details preserved in the Book of Giants is the appearance of a name that belongs to a much older and wider literary world, because among the damaged Aramaic fragments from Qumran scholars have identified the name Gilgamesh, a figure famous from Mesopotamian tradition long before these manuscripts were copied. This does not mean that the Jewish authors believed they were recording the biography of the same historical individual known from the Epic of Gilgamesh, nor does it prove that a race of enormous people once moved between Mesopotamia and the Judean desert. What it shows more securely is that names, stories, and motifs could travel across cultural boundaries and be given new roles inside different religious traditions. Gilgamesh had already become a powerful literary figure in Mesopotamia, associated with kingship, extraordinary strength, dangerous journeys, mortality, and the search for meaning in a world shaped by divine powers. By the time Jewish writers were developing Enochic traditions, the cultural memory of Mesopotamia had passed through many centuries of political contact, migration, imperial rule, trade, translation, and storytelling. So it is not surprising that elements from that older world could remain recognizable far beyond the cities where their earliest written forms had appeared. The surprise lies in what happens when such a name enters the Book of Giants. Because it is no longer functioning exactly as it does in the Mesopotamian epic tradition, it appears inside a Jewish narrative concerned with the Watchers, giant offspring, violence, dreams, and approaching judgment, showing that an inherited name could be detached from one literary setting and placed into another without carrying every feature of its earlier story with it. This is an important distinction, since ancient cultures did not preserve stories by copying them only in complete and unchanged forms. They could remember a famous name while changing the surrounding narrative, combine familiar figures with new theological concerns, or use older traditions as material for questions that mattered in a different community. The Book of Giants, therefore, gives us a small but valuable glimpse of a broader Near Eastern world in which literary boundaries were more porous than modern categories sometimes suggest. Jewish writers of the Second Temple period lived within environments shaped by the long aftermath of Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and Hellenistic power, and their literature could reflect memories and ideas that had traveled through those worlds without becoming simple copies of Mesopotamian texts. The presence of Gilgamesh should therefore be treated as evidence of literary contact or shared cultural memory at the level the surviving material can support, not as proof that the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Book of Giants describe one hidden historical event. This caution matters because fragmentary texts invite dramatic conclusions precisely where the evidence is weakest. A recognizable name can feel like a direct bridge between two ancient worlds, but a bridge of names is not the same thing as a bridge of historical identities. The ancient writers themselves were working with inherited material whose origins may already have been distant from them, just as communities throughout human history have reused legendary figures long after the circumstances that first produced those figures were forgotten. This process belongs to the deeper history of human memory, because stories often survive not as intact packages, but as pieces that can be remembered, renamed, adapted, and placed inside new explanations of the world. In the case of the Book of Giants, the appearance of Gilgamesh suggests that the Enochic imagination did not develop in complete isolation. It existed within a region where very old Mesopotamian traditions still had cultural echoes, and those echoes could be reshaped around a specifically Jewish concern with transgression, judgment, and the fate of the giant generation. At the same time, the damaged condition of the manuscripts prevents us from reconstructing every connection with confidence, and some names or relationships remain difficult to read. The safest historical picture is therefore modest, but still meaningful. A famous Mesopotamian name entered an Aramaic Jewish work connected with the Enochic world, showing that ancient literary traditions could cross borders, survive in altered forms, and acquire new meanings over time. What matters is not that Gilgamesh secretly proves the existence of giants, but that his name reveals how wide the cultural landscape behind the Book of Giants may have been, and how a story rooted in Jewish interpretation of human beginnings could still carry echoes from civilizations that had been telling their own ancient stories for centuries. Stories can travel much farther than the communities that first told them, and the ancient Near East provides many examples of names, images, and narrative patterns moving across languages, kingdoms, and religious traditions without remaining unchanged. This is the wider setting in which the Book of Giants should be understood, because the presence of Mesopotamian names does not require us to imagine that Jewish writers simply copied an older epic from beginning to end. Cultural transmission is usually less direct than that, especially across centuries of political change, migration, multilingual scribal work, and retelling for different audiences. A name such as Gilgamesh could survive because it had become memorable before the Book of Giants was written, while its meaning could gradually shift as it entered another literary environment. This is common in human storytelling because communities often borrow a familiar figure while changing the world around that figure, just as later traditions can preserve an old motif while giving it a new moral or religious purpose. The Book of Giants appears to participate in this process by placing material with Mesopotamian echoes inside an Enochic framework centered on the Watchers, their offspring, dreams, violence, and judgment. The result is neither purely Mesopotamian nor simply biblical, but a Jewish composition that belongs to its own historical setting while showing awareness of a broader cultural past. This distinction helps prevent a common mistake in reading ancient texts, where similarity is treated as proof of direct identity. Two stories may share a flood, a hero, a monster, a dream, or a divine warning because traditions have interacted, because they inherited older motifs, or because human societies repeatedly use similar narrative forms to think about danger and order. None of those possibilities alone proves that the stories describe the same historical event. In the case of the Book of Giants, the safer conclusion is that Jewish authors and scribes lived in a world where Mesopotamian cultural memories were still available in some form, even if the exact route by which each name or motif reached them can no longer be recovered. The long history of imperial contact between Mesopotamia and the western regions of the Near East created many opportunities for such movement, and literary influence does not need a single moment of translation to occur. Stories can pass through education, oral retelling, scribal traditions, inherited names, or earlier texts that have themselves been lost. This also connects to the deeper beginnings of human cultural memory. Because people have always carried stories across boundaries more easily than they carry complete archives. A memorable character can survive when the original language disappears, and a striking image can be adapted long after its first context has been forgotten. What reaches a later community may therefore be only a fragment of an older tradition, reshaped until it fits a new set of questions. In the Book of Giants, those questions concern the consequences of transgression and the approach of judgment rather than the heroic achievements associated with Gilgamesh in Mesopotamian literature. The change in function is as important as the survival of the name, because it shows that borrowing does not mean duplication. An inherited figure can become evidence of contact while also revealing creative reinterpretation. This is why the ancient literary world is better imagined as a network of crossing paths than as a line in which one book simply produces another. Some paths can be traced through surviving manuscripts, others can only be suggested by shared names or motifs, and many have disappeared entirely. The Book of Giants stands at one of those intersections, preserving a Jewish Enochic story that carries echoes from older Mesopotamian traditions while transforming them into a new meditation on disorder, inheritance, and judgment. And that transformation tells us more about how ancient cultures remembered one another than any claim that all of their stories came from one hidden historical source. Similarity can be one of the most useful clues in the study of ancient literature, but it can also become one of the easiest paths to overstatement. When two texts preserve a familiar name, a flood, a dream, a giant figure, or a story about divine judgment, the resemblance deserves attention, yet resemblance by itself does not prove that both traditions remember the same historical event. The Book of Giants is a good example because its surviving fragments belong to a Jewish Enochic world. While some of its names and motifs appear to echo much older Mesopotamian traditions, that connection is historically interesting, but it does not allow us to collapse the texts into a single hidden narrative. Gilgamesh in Mesopotamian literature belongs to a complex heroic tradition shaped over many centuries, while the name appearing in the Book of Giants has been placed inside another framework concerned with the Watchers, their offspring, dreams, violence, and judgment. The shared name therefore tells us that cultural memory could travel, not that every detail traveled unchanged. Ancient authors inherited stories in fragments, adapted familiar figures, and reshaped older material to serve new questions. A name could remain recognizable while its role changed completely. A flood motif could be reused without preserving one exact memory of one physical event. A giant figure could symbolize danger, disorder, or extraordinary power without functioning as a biological description of a lost human population. These distinctions are especially important because fragmentary manuscripts leave empty spaces that modern imagination is tempted to fill. When a text is incomplete, a dramatic theory can seem attractive simply because the missing lines cannot immediately contradict it. Historical method works in the opposite direction. The less evidence survives, the more carefully conclusions must be limited. Similarity can support the possibility of literary contact, shared cultural memory, or common inherited motifs, but stronger claims require stronger evidence. This principle applies far beyond the Book of Giants. Human cultures have exchanged stories since long before complete written archives existed, and once a story crosses a linguistic or political boundary, it can be retold in ways that preserve only part of its earlier form. Over generations, the new version may become meaningful for reasons very different from those of the older one. The earliest human communities left no written record of their thoughts, so later traditions cannot be read backward as direct reports of prehistoric life. What ancient literature can show us more reliably is how later societies imagined the distant past and used that imagined past to explain the world they inhabited. In the Enochic tradition, the age before the flood becomes a setting for questions about violence, improper knowledge, inherited consequence, and judgment. Mesopotamian echoes can enter that setting because stories and names had already crossed cultural boundaries, but the result remains a new composition with its own concerns. Recognizing this does not make the Book of Giants less significant, it makes its significance clearer. The text becomes evidence for contact between traditions, for the endurance of cultural memory, and for the creativity of ancient interpretation. What it does not become is proof of a forgotten civilization of giants. Proof that every flood story records the same global catastrophe, or proof that a Mesopotamian hero and an Enochic giant were one historical individual. Those conclusions go beyond what the manuscripts can support. The stronger lesson is quieter. Ancient people did not preserve the past by sealing stories inside fixed containers. They carried names, images, warnings, and fragments across generations, and each community could give those inherited pieces a different meaning. The Book of Giants stands within that long human process, not as a key that unlocks one secret event behind every ancient story, but as evidence that traditions could meet, overlap, and change without becoming identical. That boundary between connection and identity allows the fragments to remain valuable without turning mythology into history. The simplest way to misunderstand the Book of Giants is to imagine that a complete copy of Enoch once contained a chapter about the giants and that someone later removed it. The surviving manuscripts do not give us evidence for such a clean sequence. What they show instead is a literary world in which several writings connected with Enoch circulated, overlapped in themes, and were preserved along different paths. The Book of Giants clearly belongs near the Watcher's tradition because it assumes the same basic crisis of heavenly beings, human women, giant offspring, violence, and approaching judgment. Yet proximity does not prove that the work once occupied a fixed place inside the collection later known as one Enoch. This distinction matters because modern readers are accustomed to books with stable tables of contents. While ancient compositions could circulate separately, be copied beside related works, be translated at different times, or disappear from one transmission line while surviving in another. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve Aramaic copies of several Enochic writings, and also preserve the Book of Giants, which allows scholars to see that the traditions were close without forcing them into one original volume. The question is therefore not whether a missing page can be located, but how a related composition could belong to the same intellectual world and still follow a different history. Once this is understood, the phrase "left out" becomes more precise. It can describe what later readers of the surviving Enoch collection no longer encountered, but it should not be used as proof of deliberate exclusion. There is no need to imagine a council, editor, or hidden authority deciding to erase the giants from a finished Enoch book unless independent evidence can demonstrate such an act. Ordinary processes of transmission are enough to explain why ancient works diverge. Some texts are copied more often, some enter collections, some are translated into languages that continue to be read, and others gradually vanish because the communities preserving them change. The Book of Giants appears to have followed one of these less secure paths. Its Aramaic remains at Qumran show that the work was real, known, and copied, while its absence from the later complete Ethiopic form of one Enoch shows that close literary relationship does not guarantee identical preservation. This is a pattern visible throughout the history of human memory, because the earliest written cultures never transmitted every story, law, prayer, genealogy, and interpretation they produced. What survives is always a selection shaped by material durability. Scribal choices, language, geography, political disruption, and chance. The same rule applies here. The loss of a composition does not automatically reveal suppression, and survival does not automatically prove official status. What the manuscripts allow us to say is quieter and stronger. The Book of Giants belonged to the broad Enochic environment, shared its characters and concerns, and offered a perspective on the giant generation that the later form of one Enoch did not preserve within its collection. That answer is less dramatic than a story about a forbidden chapter, but it is historically more useful because it respects the difference between literary relationship and physical inclusion. The title therefore opens a real question, but the evidence changes the shape of the answer. What was left out was not necessarily a chapter cut from a finished book, but a related branch of an older Enochic tradition that later readers no longer received as part of the Enoch collection they inherited. This distinction also protects the historical value of the fragments from a modern habit of turning every absence into a conspiracy. Ancient libraries were vulnerable. Manuscript traditions could narrow without leaving records of why, and communities could preserve neighboring works differently for reasons that are now completely lost. Uncertainty here is not a weakness in the evidence, but part of the evidence itself, because the surviving pattern tells us that textual boundaries changed across time. The Book of Giants makes the most sense when it is placed beside the other Enochic writings rather than forced inside them, because the surviving evidence shows a relationship that is close, recognizable, and still distinct. Its world is already familiar to anyone who knows the Watcher's tradition, where heavenly beings cross a forbidden boundary. Human women become part of that transgression. Giant offspring appear. Violence spreads, and judgment approaches. Yet the Book of Giants takes this inherited setting and gives it a different center of attention. Instead of concentrating mainly on the descent of the Watchers and the origin of the crisis, it follows the generation born from that crisis and allows those figures to speak, dream, question, and seek interpretation. Enoch remains important, but his role changes, becoming a figure of knowledge to whom the giants turn when their own understanding fails. This combination of shared background and changed emphasis is what we would expect from a literary tradition capable of producing related compositions rather than one fixed book with one permanent table of contents. Ancient Jewish writers could return to the same inherited characters and problems more than once, exploring one theme through heavenly rebellion, another through judgment, and another through descendants living inside the consequences. The result is a family resemblance rather than perfect identity. The Book of Giants can therefore be called Enochic because it participates in the same network of ideas, but that label does not require us to claim that it once occupied a precise place inside the later form of one Enoch. This is an important historical distinction because collections grow through transmission. Writings that circulate separately can later be gathered, while closely related writings can remain outside a collection, even if they share characters and theological concerns. What survives at Qumran gives us a glimpse of that earlier diversity, before later manuscript traditions narrowed the range of texts that most readers would eventually associate with Enoch. From this perspective, the Book of Giants is not an orphan and not a missing page, but a neighboring composition whose existence shows how broad the Enochic world once was. Its relationship to the Watcher's tradition is strong enough to make the connection clear, yet its own focus gives it a reason to stand apart. When these writings survive unevenly, later readers can mistake the surviving collection for the whole tradition, forgetting that the boundaries they inherited may be the result of centuries of copying rather than the original shape of the literary world. The Book of Giants corrects that impression simply by existing. It tells us that ancient readers could encounter an Enochic story in which the giant generation received much more attention than it does in the later complete form of one Enoch. This does not prove that someone deliberately excluded that perspective, but it does show that later transmission preserved only one arrangement among several possibilities that once existed. The deeper lesson reaches beyond Enoch, because the history of written culture is full of related works that follow different paths through languages, communities, and centuries. Some became central, some became marginal, and some nearly disappeared. The surviving fragments remind us that literary traditions are shaped as much by what continues to be copied as by what was first written. Seen in that light, the Book of Giants stands close enough to Enoch to illuminate the same ancient questions about human beginnings, disorder, inherited consequence, and judgment, while remaining separate enough to show that the Enochic world was never limited to the boundaries of the book later readers happened to receive. Understanding that position brings the title into sharper focus, because what was absent from later Enoch was not necessarily a torn-out chapter, but a neighboring perspective that once circulated within the same wider world of ideas. The same characters could therefore support several related narratives, each preserving a different emphasis without requiring a single original volume. What later readers no longer had was not simply a missing page, but access to a line of interpretation that had once stood close to the Enochic world and then followed a different path through history. This is where the title becomes more precise, because the Book of Giants preserves material absent from the complete form of one Enoch known through the Ethiopic tradition. Yet absence is not the same as evidence of deliberate removal. At Qumran, the Book of Giants appears in Aramaic manuscripts alongside other Enochic writings, showing that ancient readers knew a broader body of literature than the collection known today. Within that environment, the story of the Watchers could be approached from more than one direction. One composition could explain the descent of heavenly beings and the corruption that followed, while another could spend more time with the giant offspring as they received dreams, discussed warnings, sent Mahaway to seek Enoch, and confronted approaching judgment. Later readers who inherited one Enoch without the Book of Giants therefore lost access to that expanded perspective on the descendants themselves. They still had the Watchers, the forbidden unions, the violent offspring, and the movement toward judgment, but they did not receive the surviving giant-centered narrative in the same collection. This difference matters because it shows how the memory of tradition can narrow even when its central framework survives. Human communities preserve texts through copying, and copying is never automatic. Every generation needs people who can read the language, value the work, and reproduce it. If that chain weakens, a composition can disappear without anyone issuing an order against it. Translation adds another layer, because a work that enters a language used by a durable community may survive, while a neighboring work remaining in another language becomes increasingly vulnerable. The complete survival of one Enoch in Ethiopic is therefore not a map of everything that once belonged to the Enochic literary environment. It is evidence of one successful path of transmission. The Book of Giants represents another path, one that became far more fragmentary in its Jewish form, and was also adapted within later Manichaean tradition. This uneven survival changed the question. Before such manuscripts were available, later readers could only work with collections history had preserved for them. But Qumran exposed traces of an earlier textual landscape in which Enochic writings circulated with greater variety. The fragments do not recover every lost composition, and they do not tell us exactly why one writing entered a later collection while another did not. They demonstrate that the surviving boundary of one Enoch should not be mistaken for the complete boundary of ancient Enochic creativity. This connects with a much older pattern in human memory, because from the earliest surviving written cultures, what later generations know is shaped by accidents of preservation as much as by what earlier generations created. A clay tablet may survive where organic writing disappears. A translated book may travel where its original language fades, and a text repeatedly copied for religious use may outlive another work that once stood beside it. The Book of Giants sits inside that pattern. What later readers lacked was not necessarily forbidden knowledge, but literary context, another set of voices, another angle on the consequences of the watcher's story, and another example of how ancient Jewish writers could reinterpret the beginnings of humanity through narratives of violence, inheritance, and judgment. This answer may be quieter than the idea of a suppressed chapter, but it is more faithful to the evidence. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not reveal someone cutting the Book of Giants out of Enoch. They reveal that the Enochic world was once larger than the form of Enoch that survived most completely, and that part of that larger world slipped out of the main line of transmission, while leaving enough fragments behind for modern readers to recognize what had been lost. For centuries after the Jewish Book of Giants was copied in Aramaic, the tradition did not simply vanish, but neither can its journey be reconstructed as an unbroken chain from Qumran to every later form that bears the same name. What survives instead points to a later transformation in the religious world of Mani, the 3rd century founder of Manichaeism, whose scriptures included a Book of Giants shaped from earlier Enochic material. The connection is important because parallels between the Qumran fragments and the Manichaean work show that the older Jewish tradition continued to influence new communities long after the manuscripts near the Dead Sea had ceased to be copied in the setting where we first recover them. Names, episodes, and narrative structures reappear, including figures connected with Mahaway and the giant generation. Yet the later work belongs to a different religious system and cannot be treated as a simple duplicate of the Aramaic composition. Mani and his followers received older traditions and placed them inside a wider Manichaean account of cosmic conflict, revelation, and the struggle between light and darkness, which means that continuity existed together with reinterpretation. This is one of the clearest reasons historians must distinguish survival from preservation in an unchanged form. A story can survive because it is adapted, translated, and made meaningful in another community, even when the earlier version no longer circulates in the same way. The Book of Giants appears to have undergone such a change, carrying recognizable Enochic material beyond its earlier Jewish environment while acquiring new theological meanings. The exact route by which Mani encountered the tradition is not fully visible, and the evidence does not permit a confident reconstruction of every intermediary text or community, so it would be misleading to imagine a single manuscript traveling intact across centuries until it reached him. What can be said more securely is that scholarship has identified substantial dependence of the Manichaean Book of Giants on earlier Jewish Enochic traditions, including material known from Qumran. That dependence reveals something important about the movement of ancient literature through the Near East, where religious ideas did not remain sealed inside one language or one community. Aramaic, Syriac, Middle Persian, Parthian, Sogdian, and other languages eventually became part of the wider Manichaean textual world, and stories could be translated as the religion spread across regions far from its Mesopotamian beginnings. This does not mean every surviving fragment in those languages preserves the same wording, because translation and adaptation naturally create differences, but it shows how an older narrative could continue to live after its first known manuscript setting had disappeared. The pattern also belongs to the larger history of human memory, because written traditions survive only when communities continue to find reasons to reproduce them. When one community stops copying a text, another may preserve a transformed version, and centuries later the two can appear separated by gaps that no archive can completely fill. The Book of Giants, therefore, offers an unusual example of a tradition whose Jewish form became fragmentary, while a related later form entered the scriptural world of another religion. This later survival does not prove that the Manichaean text can restore every missing line at Qumran, but it can sometimes help scholars recognize shared characters, episodes, and narrative relationships while still respecting the differences between the witnesses. Those differences are historically valuable in their own right, because they show that transmission is not merely mechanical copying but an act of reinterpretation. A story about the consequences of the Watchers could be received by another religious movement and made to speak within a new understanding of the cosmos. What had begun as part of an ancient Jewish meditation on rebellion, violence, inherited consequence, and judgment could therefore continue in a new environment without remaining unchanged. The journey after Qumran is best understood not as the secret survival of one forbidden book, but as the movement of a literary tradition across time, language, and religious boundaries, leaving behind enough related traces to show continuity while preserving enough difference to remind us that every generation that carries a text forward also changes the conditions under which that text is understood. When Mani adopted the tradition of the giants, he did not simply preserve an older Jewish composition unchanged, because the Manichaean Book of Giants belonged to a different religious system centered on the conflict between light and darkness. The earlier Enochic tradition had already provided a story in which heavenly beings crossed a forbidden boundary. Giant offspring appeared, violence spread, and judgment approached. And Mani appears to have recognized in that material themes that could be reworked within his own cosmology. This is why the later Manichaean text is both related to the Jewish Book of Giants and different from it. Characters and names remain recognizable. Some episodes have parallels, and the dependence on earlier Enochic traditions is substantial, yet the meaning surrounding those elements has shifted. In Manichaeism, the universe is understood through opposed realms, the entanglement of light with darkness, and the need for liberation. So, inherited giant traditions could be interpreted as part of a cosmic struggle different from Second Temple Jewish literature. The historical point is not that Mani copied an ancient scroll word for word, but that he received an Enochic tradition that could be transformed. Texts rarely move across centuries and communities without being translated into new systems of meaning. A story can retain its characters while its theology changes, preserve a name while assigning that name another role, or keep the outline of an episode while adapting its significance for another audience. The Manichaean Book of Giants shows this process because later fragments preserve figures from the older tradition, including Mahoway and other giants, while placing them inside a Manichaean intellectual world. Some names remained close to earlier Aramaic forms, while others were adapted through Iranian cultural forms, showing that transmission could involve change at the level of identity as well as language. These differences do not weaken the connection with Qumran, but they warn against using later Manichaean material as a key for restoring every missing line of the Jewish fragments. When two versions agree, the parallel may help scholars recognize an older narrative element. But when the later version develops a new theological interpretation, that development belongs to Manichaeism rather than automatically to the earlier Jewish text. This distinction matters for the central question, because the continued life of the giant tradition outside the surviving form of one Enoch shows that an idea can disappear from one transmission line while flourishing in another. What one community no longer copies can be taken up by another and given renewed importance. The result is not proof that the original work was suppressed, but evidence that literary survival is uneven and dependent on changing networks of readers from the earliest history of writing. Human beings have preserved stories by adapting them to new languages and systems of belief, and every adaptation carries both memory and change. Mani's use of the giant tradition belongs to this larger pattern. He inherited material connected with an ancient Jewish interpretation of the beginnings of humanity, but he did not leave that material untouched. he placed it inside a religious vision concerned with cosmic imprisonment, revelation, and liberation, allowing the giants to participate in a different explanation of disorder. This helps explain how the tradition could travel beyond the Judean desert, because a text reinterpreted for a new community can become portable in ways that an older manuscript tradition may not. The Book of Giants, therefore, survives after Qumran not as a frozen relic, but as a transformed tradition whose later history preserves continuity without erasing change by separating what is inherited from what is reworked. Mani can be understood neither as the creator of the giant's story nor as a passive copyist, but as a later religious author who reshaped an existing Enochic inheritance into a different cosmological language, and that act of rewriting helped part of the older tradition continue after its Jewish form had become fragmentary. The later history of the Book of Giants carries the tradition far beyond the caves of the Judean desert, because once Manichaeism began to spread eastward, stories inherited from the older Enochic world entered communities that spoke different languages and lived within very different cultural environments. This movement did not preserve one unchanged Jewish manuscript traveling intact from place to place, but it did preserve enough of the giant tradition for scholars to recognize continuity across a much wider geography. Manichaean communities established themselves across Iran and Central Asia, and fragments connected with Mani's Book of Giants survive in languages including Middle Persian, Sogdian, and Old Turkish, alongside evidence from other areas of the Manichaean textual tradition. The importance of these witnesses lies not in their ability to reproduce every missing Aramaic line from Qumran, but in the way they show that the story continued to be copied, translated, interpreted, and adapted after its earlier Jewish setting had changed. Central Asia was especially important for the preservation of Manichaean literature because communities there participated in networks of trade, religion, and multilingual writing that connected regions separated by enormous distances. Sogdian merchants and religious communities helped carry ideas across these routes, and Manichaean writings became part of a textual world in which Iranian, Turkic, and other cultural elements could interact. Within that environment, the Book of Giants did not remain untouched. Names could be adapted, explanations could be reshaped, and inherited figures could be interpreted through concepts familiar to new audiences. Enoch himself could acquire meanings that reflected Manichaean and even Buddhist forms of religious vocabulary in Central Asian settings, showing how far a figure rooted in ancient Jewish tradition could travel from his earlier literary home. Such changes are not evidence that the older story was corrupted beyond recognition, nor are they proof that every later detail was already present in the Qumran version. They are evidence of transmission, because a text that survives across cultures often does so by becoming understandable within those cultures. The difference between continuity and transformation is therefore essential. A recognizable name, episode, or relationship may point back toward an older Enochic source, while a new cosmological explanation may belong entirely to the later Manichaean community that preserved it. This is why scholars compare the witnesses carefully, rather than treating the Central Asian fragments as a complete replacement for what is missing at Qumran. When the traditions overlap, they can reveal that certain narrative elements traveled across centuries, but when they diverge, the divergence itself becomes part of the history. This long movement also connects to the broader history of human memory, because stories have rarely survived only by remaining fixed. Languages disappear, political centers collapse, communities migrate, and religions enter new regions. Yet a story can continue if someone translates it, copies it, or gives it a place within a new intellectual world. The Book of Giants offers a particularly clear example because the oldest surviving Jewish witnesses are fragmentary, while later Manichaean witnesses preserve related material at great geographical distance from Qumran. What links these remains is not a perfect physical chain that historians can follow manuscript by manuscript, but a pattern of recognizable inheritance. The Watchers, their descendants, figures such as Mahaway, and the larger concern with disorder and consequence remain visible even while the surrounding theology changes. This means that the tradition survived not because history protected one original book, but because different communities repeatedly made the story usable again. There is something important in that pattern for understanding the beginnings of written culture itself. Early texts were always dependent on human choices, and no manuscript could cross centuries without being recopied by people who considered it worth preserving. Every translation was therefore both an act of memory and an act of change. By the time the giant tradition reached communities deep in Central Asia, it had traveled far from the Jewish world in which the Aramaic fragments had first circulated, yet traces of that earlier world were still present. The result is not a straight line from Enoch to Qumran to Mani to Central Asia, but a branching history in which older material was preserved through new religious identities, new languages, and new interpretations. This is why the Eastern survival of the Book of Giants matters so much, because it shows that a work can disappear from one major textual collection and still continue elsewhere, not as a forbidden secret waiting to be recovered, but as a living tradition capable of crossing boundaries that the original authors could never have foreseen. The missing lines of the Book of Giants are not empty spaces waiting for modern readers to fill with whatever seems possible. They are limits, and those limits are part of the evidence. The surviving Aramaic manuscripts from Qumran are made of fragments, some large enough to preserve several lines, and others reduced to only a few letters or words. Their broken edges interrupt sentences, separate names from actions, and sometimes leave scholars uncertain about what came before or after a surviving phrase. This makes reconstruction necessary, but it also makes reconstruction dangerous when possibility is mistaken for certainty. A damaged manuscript can preserve enough language to identify a character, recognize a repeated expression, or connect one fragment with another. Yet no method can recover a vanished sentence simply because the missing sentence would make the story easier to understand. Scholars compare handwriting, material features, vocabulary, grammar, surviving margins, and parallels in related texts to determine how pieces may fit together. They can also compare separate copies of the same composition when more than one manuscript preserves overlapping material. These methods can produce strong proposals, but even a strong proposal remains different from a line that can still be read directly on the parchment. That difference is especially important for the Book of Giants, because the work survives in several Qumran manuscripts rather than in one continuous copy. Multiple witnesses can confirm that the composition circulated and can sometimes help restore a damaged passage, but they do not give us a complete sequence from beginning to end. Large portions remain missing, and the original order of some fragments continues to be debated. Later Manichaean versions provide another source of comparison, yet they belong to a different period, language, environment, and religious system. When they preserve a similar name or episode, they may help identify an older element of the tradition, but they cannot automatically be inserted into every Aramaic gap. The later material has passed through translation and reinterpretation, so agreement is useful evidence while disagreement must also be respected. This discipline of leaving gaps open connects the Book of Giants to a much wider problem in the history of human memory. The earliest written cultures did not leave complete archives of everything they knew, believed, feared, or imagined. Fires, decay, war, abandonment, changing languages, and the simple end of copying erased enormous amounts of written material. What survives from antiquity is therefore never identical with everything that once existed. The temptation is to turn absence into mystery, but historical method asks a quieter question. What can the surviving object actually support? For the Book of Giants, it supports the existence of a real ancient Jewish composition in Aramaic, the presence of recognizable characters and episodes, close connections with Enochic traditions, and a later history of adaptation. It does not support a complete hidden biography of the giants, precise physical descriptions that the fragments do not preserve, or a confident account of every missing scene. The missing lines also remind us that reconstruction is not failure. A text does not become worthless because parts of it cannot be recovered. In some ways, the uncertainty helps reveal how ancient literature really reaches the present, not as a perfect message untouched by time, but as a damaged object that must be read with patience. Every surviving word carries more weight because it has passed through centuries in which most of its neighbors disappeared. The responsible task is therefore not to make the Book of Giants complete at any cost, but to understand how much of its world can be recovered without crossing the line from evidence into invention. The fragments preserve enough to show that the lost work was larger than what remains, but the silence between those fragments must continue to mark the boundary of what we honestly know. That boundary is not an obstacle to understanding the ancient world. It is one of the clearest lessons the manuscripts preserve, because responsible history begins by separating what survives, what can reasonably be reconstructed, and what has disappeared beyond recovery. Reconstructing the Book of Giants is an exercise in discipline because the surviving fragments invite connection while constantly reminding us that connection is not the same as recovery. Scholars can sometimes determine that two pieces once belonged to the same manuscript by comparing the shape of the parchment, the direction of the fibers, the handwriting, the spacing of lines, the margins, and the vocabulary that survives. And when several clues point in the same direction, a proposed arrangement can become persuasive. Language provides another layer of evidence, because Aramaic grammar can limit which words are likely to fit a damaged sentence. Repeated expressions can reveal patterns, and recognizable names can help locate a fragment within the larger narrative. When more than one copy of a composition survives, overlapping wording can sometimes restore letters lost from one manuscript through comparison with another. These methods are careful and cumulative, yet none of them gives permission to create a continuous story wherever the manuscript falls silent. A reconstruction becomes stronger when several independent features support it, but even then the responsible reader must distinguish between ink that still exists and words supplied by modern editors. This difference may seem technical, but it protects the history of the text from being replaced by a modern version that only appears ancient. The Book of Giants is especially vulnerable to this problem because its surviving scenes are compelling enough to encourage completion. Dreams appear without every surrounding line. Characters speak while parts of their conversations are missing, and names survive where actions have been damaged. The mind naturally wants to connect these pieces into a complete sequence, but the most attractive connection is not always the most defensible one. Later Manichaean material can sometimes help because it preserves related characters and episodes. Yet those later witnesses emerged from different languages, centuries, and religious settings. When a later text resembles an Aramaic fragment, the agreement may preserve an older element, but when it supplies details absent from Qumran, those details cannot automatically be projected backward. Transmission is not a transparent window into an original form, because every translation and adaptation can preserve, alter, expand, or reinterpret what came before. This is why historical reconstruction works through degrees of confidence rather than one simple category of true or false. One reading may be almost certain because the letters remain visible. Another may be highly probable because grammar and parallel materials support it, while another remains possible but unproven. Responsible scholarship marks those differences instead of smoothing them away. The same principle applies to larger claims about the narrative. If several fragments show that giant figures experienced dreams and sought interpretation, that pattern can be described with confidence. But if the manuscript does not preserve a complete conversation explaining every motive, those motives should not be invented. If a name connected with Mesopotamian tradition appears, literary contact can be discussed. But a hidden historical biography cannot be constructed from the name alone. If later traditions preserve similar scenes, they can illuminate the history of transmission without becoming substitutes for missing Aramaic pages. This way of reading may feel slower, but slowness is an advantage when evidence is fragmentary. The earliest human archives are full of damaged voices, and learning to hear them requires accepting that some questions will remain unanswered. Archaeology and textual history do not become stronger by eliminating uncertainty. They become stronger by showing exactly where certainty stops. The Book of Giants, therefore, offers a useful lesson in how knowledge is built from incomplete remains. Modern scholars are not merely guessing, because they use material evidence, linguistic comparison, manuscript analysis, and related traditions. But neither are they recovering a perfect lost book line by line. They are constructing models that remain open to revision when new readings or better arrangements appear. Imagination still has a place, but it must be recognized as imagination. It can help us visualize how a damaged manuscript once looked or how separated scenes might have connected. Yet it cannot be presented as though the parchment itself confirmed those details. The difference between reconstruction and invention is therefore not a matter of style, but of honesty. One works outward from surviving evidence and marks uncertainty, while the other fills silence without admitting the gap. For a text already surrounded by modern legends about forbidden books, hidden giants, and suppressed histories, that distinction is especially important. The fragments are remarkable enough without adding claims they cannot support. Their value lies in the fact that they preserve a real, ancient composition, connected to a known literary tradition, copied by real scribes, and transmitted through a history that can be studied even when much of the wording has disappeared. The more carefully the missing spaces are respected, the more clearly the surviving words can show us what ancient readers actually inherited, rather than what modern imagination wishes they had written. The Book of Giants becomes easiest to misread when an ancient literary tradition is combined with modern claims that the surviving evidence does not support. Stories about enormous skeletons, suppressed archaeological discoveries, hidden races of giants, or forgotten civilizations are often attached to texts like this because the word giant invites a literal physical interpretation. Yet the manuscripts from Qumran do not provide measurements, anatomical descriptions, graves, bones, settlements, or any other material evidence that would establish the existence of a distinct population of gigantic humans. What they preserve is an ancient religious narrative in which extraordinary beings belong to a world of watchers, transgression, dreams, violence, and judgment. Archaeology asks a different kind of question from literature, and keeping those questions separate protects both fields. A text can tell us what an ancient community imagined, feared, debated, or inherited without proving that every figure in the story existed as a biological population. In the same way, archaeological remains can tell us about bodies, settlements, tools, diets, movement, and burial practices without confirming every narrative preserved in later religious literature. When modern claims about giant skeletons appear, they require the same standards of evidence applied to any archaeological claim, including documented excavation context, reliable measurements, physical specimens, publication, and independent examination. Without that chain of evidence, a photograph, newspaper, anecdote, or repeated internet story cannot establish a new human lineage. This distinction is especially important because the deep history of humanity is already supported by a large and growing body of fossil, genetic, and archaeological evidence, and none of that accepted evidence requires a vanished race of giant humans to explain our origins. Ancient people certainly encountered individuals who were unusually tall, and human stature varies within populations, but variation in height is not the same as evidence for a separate giant species or civilization. The giants of Enochic literature belong instead to a symbolic and theological landscape where physical excess accompanies moral disorder and where great strength cannot prevent judgment. Reading them in that setting does not reduce their importance. It allows the text to speak in the categories in which it was written. The Book of Giants becomes a source for understanding ancient Jewish interpretation, the development of Enochic traditions, and the movement of stories across cultures rather than a substitute for missing archaeological evidence. This approach also guards against another common error, the belief that the absence of accepted evidence proves that institutions must be hiding it. Historical knowledge is often incomplete, but incompleteness is not evidence of suppression. Bones decay, sites are disturbed, manuscripts disappear, and archives survive unevenly, yet genuine discoveries leave material traces that can be examined by other researchers. The responsible response to uncertainty is therefore not to fill the gap with the most dramatic possibility, but to ask what kind of evidence would be needed to support the claim. This matters for the earliest history of humanity, because stories about origins are especially vulnerable to being treated as literal reports of prehistory. Ancient writers looked backward toward a distant beginning and used that imagined past to think about violence, knowledge, responsibility, and the limits of power. Their narratives can preserve important information about the societies that produced them, even when they do not describe prehistoric events in a modern scientific sense. The Book of Giants is valuable precisely because it belongs to that history of ideas. Its fragments reveal that ancient Jewish readers knew a broader Enochic literary world than the one later preserved in complete form, and that some of its themes continued into other religious traditions. None of that requires a hidden race, a forbidden archaeological secret, or a lost civilization of enormous humans. The more carefully those modern additions are removed, the clearer the ancient text becomes. The giants remain extraordinary literary beings, but the real historical evidence lies in the manuscripts, the languages, the scribes, the transmission of stories, and the changing communities that preserved them. By refusing to turn mythology into pseudo-history, we do not make the Book of Giants smaller. We allow its real significance to emerge from what can actually be known. The Book of Giants matters most when the giants themselves stop being the only reason we are looking at it, because the surviving fragments reveal something larger than a strange ancient story about extraordinary beings. They preserve evidence of how Jewish writers in the Second Temple period thought about inherited traditions, moral disorder, human beginnings, and the consequences of power that escapes restraint. The giants stand inside that world as literary figures, but the questions surrounding them are broader. Why does violence spread from one generation to another? How does wrongdoing reshape the world around those who did not begin it? And what happens when strength can no longer change the outcome? Ancient writers used the distant age before the flood as a setting in which the roots of disorder could be imagined and examined. The Book of Giants takes that inherited setting and shifts attention toward descendants who live inside the consequences of an earlier transgression. Their dreams, their search for interpretation, and their awareness of approaching judgment create a perspective that differs from the stronger emphasis on the watchers in other Enochic writings. This change in perspective is historically valuable because it shows that ancient traditions were not fixed explanations repeated without variation. Communities could return to the same inherited material and ask different questions of it. One composition could concentrate on the cause of disorder, another on judgment, and another on the generation caught between those points. The Book of Giants, therefore, gives us evidence not for a hidden race of enormous humans, but for the flexibility of ancient interpretation. The Dead Sea Scrolls, therefore, matter greatly. Without the damaged Aramaic manuscripts from Qumran, later readers would have had a narrower picture of the Enochic landscape. The fragments reveal that texts could circulate near one another without all becoming members of the same later collection, and that a work could be copied more than once while still failing to survive in a complete Jewish form. What was lost was not merely a sequence of episodes, but evidence of diversity within an ancient intellectual tradition. That diversity is itself a lesson about human memory. From the earliest written cultures onward, people have never transmitted everything they inherited. They select, copy, translate, reorganize, and sometimes forget. A text that survives may appear central because its chain of copying remains strong, while another work that once stood beside it can disappear almost completely. The Book of Giants allows us to see that process because its existence is secure, while its original shape is largely gone. The remaining pieces show that ancient readers knew a story later generations did not receive in the same form, but they are not enough to rebuild every scene or answer every question. Accepting that limit is a more accurate way of understanding the past. Historical knowledge grows not only when new facts are found, but also when the boundary between evidence and imagination becomes clearer. The giants, therefore, become less important as supposed bodies, and more important as witnesses to a human habit that reaches far back into recorded culture. The habit of using stories about beginnings to explain why the present contains violence, uncertainty, and inherited consequences. These texts do not tell us how prehistoric people actually thought, because the writers lived much later and wrote within their own religious worlds. But they do tell us how ancient Jewish communities reflected on the origins of disorder and on the limits of power. That distinction gives the Book of Giants enduring value. It belongs neither to modern science nor to hidden archaeology, but to the history of ideas, texts, and memory. The most important question is no longer whether giants once walked the earth, but why ancient people found the image of giants useful for thinking about a world in which strength could become destructive and every generation could inherit consequences it did not fully choose. The Dead Sea Scrolls changed the study of Enochic literature not because they revealed a secret version of human history, but because they placed older manuscripts beside traditions that had previously been known mainly through much later copies. Before the discoveries near Qumran, scholars already knew one Enoch through the Ethiopic tradition, and portions of Enochic material were also preserved in other languages. But the Aramaic fragments provided direct evidence that important Enochic compositions circulated in Jewish communities many centuries earlier. This shifted the question from whether such traditions were late inventions to how varied those traditions had already become in antiquity. Among the manuscripts were fragments corresponding to several Enochic writings, along with copies of the Book of Giants, and their coexistence revealed a literary environment broader than the boundaries of the complete form of one Enoch known today. The importance of this evidence is easy to exaggerate in one direction and underestimate in another. It does not prove that Qumran contained a forbidden archive exposing hidden events from the beginning of humanity, and it does not establish that giants, watchers, or heavenly journeys should be treated as archaeological descriptions. What it demonstrates is historically substantial enough without those claims. Jewish writers and readers during the Second Temple period were engaging with a diverse body of traditions connected with Enoch, and some of those traditions later survived together while others followed separate paths. The Book of Giants makes this especially clear because its Aramaic fragments share the world of the Watchers while giving greater narrative attention to their offspring. Yet that perspective was not preserved inside the later complete Ethiopic collection. This discovery changes how absence should be understood. When a work is missing from a later collection, we can no longer assume that ancient readers never knew it, just as we cannot assume that it was deliberately removed. Manuscript evidence shows that literary history is shaped by branching transmission. One community copies one composition. Another preserves a neighboring text. A translator carries certain writings into another language, and over centuries the surviving paths become narrower than the world from which they began. The Dead Sea Scrolls allow us to look backward before that narrowing was complete. They reveal that ancient Jewish textual culture contained biblical manuscripts, interpretations, legal works, prayers, hymns, apocalyptic writings, and many other compositions existing beside one another in a landscape that was intellectually varied. The Enochic materials belong to that diversity. They show that the distant beginnings of humanity could be imagined through more than one narrative lens, with different writings emphasizing the Watchers, cosmic order, judgment, dreams, wisdom, or the consequences inherited by the giants. None of these texts can provide direct access to what prehistoric humans actually believed, because their authors lived vastly later than the earliest human communities and wrote within their own historical and religious environments. Instead, they reveal how ancient Jewish communities used imagined beginnings to think about the problems of their own moral universe. This distinction is essential because it preserves both scientific honesty and historical value. Archaeology and genetics investigate human origins through physical evidence, while texts like the Book of Giants tell us about the intellectual history of people who interpreted those origins through sacred narrative. The Dead Sea Scrolls bring those two kinds of knowledge into clearer separation rather than collapsing them together. They remind us that an ancient document is evidence first of the people who wrote, copied, read, and preserved it. This is one of the deeper lessons of the discovery, because human memory has never survived as a complete archive. Every civilization leaves behind only a fraction of its speech, writing, and interpretation, and the fraction that reaches us can distort our sense of what was once common or diverse. A text preserved completely may appear more central simply because its transmission succeeded, while another composition may seem marginal only because almost all of its manuscripts disappeared. The Book of Giants warns against confusing survival with original importance. Several surviving copies at Qumran show that the work was copied, yet later Jewish transmission did not preserve it intact. Its story then continued in altered form through Manichaean communities, demonstrating that disappearance from one path does not necessarily mean disappearance from all paths. This is what the Dead Sea Scrolls truly changed. They expanded the visible map of ancient literature and showed that later collections are sometimes only surviving islands from a much larger textual landscape. The lesson is therefore not that someone hid the truth from later readers, but that history itself is selective. Texts are lost, languages fade, collections change, and communities preserve different portions of what they inherit. Once that is understood, the Book of Giants becomes more valuable, not less. Because its broken pages reveal a world of interpretation that had nearly disappeared and teach us to approach every surviving ancient book with a quieter question. Not only what does this text contain, but what larger world of texts may once have existed around it? The meaning of a missing book is not that someone must have hidden it, but that human memory has always been incomplete and vulnerable to loss. The Book of Giants survives as a clear reminder because its existence is certain while most of its original wording is gone. Enough fragments remain to show that ancient Jewish readers knew a work closely connected with the Enochic world, a work in which descendants of the Watchers received dreams, sought interpretation, confronted judgment, and occupied a larger place than they do in the later complete form of one Enoch. Yet the fragments do not preserve every scene or every stage of transmission, and that incompleteness should not be repaired by invention. It is part of the history itself. What survives tells us that ancient literature was broader than the collections later generations inherited. And what vanished reminds us that the past was never preserved equally. One text could be translated and recopied for centuries, while another related work disappeared almost completely. One community could preserve a tradition that another no longer used. This is why the Book of Giants should not be reduced either to a forbidden chapter or to a curiosity about enormous beings. Its deeper value lies in showing how traditions branch, how stories move between cultures, and how later readers can mistake the surviving branch for the whole tree. The Dead Sea Scrolls gave modern scholarship a way to see beyond that impression by revealing manuscripts from an earlier stage of Jewish textual culture, where Enochic writings circulated in greater variety than later collections suggest. This does not mean every missing work was equally important. It means survival is not a perfect measure of original significance. Ancient people wrote far more than we possess, and early archives are full of silence because materials decayed, languages changed, libraries vanished, communities migrated, and copying stopped. The same pattern appears throughout human history, from damaged inscriptions to lost chronicles known only through later references. When we study such remains, the most honest response is careful proportion. We can say what the evidence supports and leave open what the manuscripts no longer allow us to know. The Book of Giants teaches that restraint can itself be a form of knowledge. Refusing to turn fragments into sensational claims protects the real significance of the text, because the surviving evidence already tells an important story about human memory without requiring hidden skeletons, secret civilizations, or deliberate suppression. It tells us that ancient Jewish writers returned to the imagined beginnings of humanity and used that distant world to think about violence, inherited consequences, the limits of power, and judgment. It tells us that those ideas did not remain fixed, but crossed textual boundaries and later entered another religious tradition, where they were adapted again. And it tells us that what later generations call a book may be only one surviving arrangement within a larger history of interpretation. This is the educational value that remains after exaggeration is removed. The past is not a sealed room waiting for one final key, but a landscape of surviving traces whose meaning becomes clearer when we accept both what can be recovered and what cannot. The Book of Giants does not give us a lost chapter of human biological history, but it does give us a lesson in how cultures remember, forget, reinterpret, and carry fragments of meaning across centuries. That lesson belongs to us as well, because our understanding of the past is built from choices about what we preserve, what we repeat, and what we allow to disappear. Perhaps that is why a broken text can still feel powerful, not because it promises a secret answer, but because it leaves us facing the limits of memory itself. The unanswered question is how many other worlds of thought have disappeared so completely that we no longer even know what questions they once asked.